from MDNR. John works in the County Geologic Atlas program at the DNR. And he's been at the DNR for 7 years after doing consulting work here in the Twin Cities as well. And today he's going to talk about Karst Hydrogeology in southeast Minnesota. Looking forward to the talk.
All right, thank you. So yes, I was asked to come here, and people from our group, from the Geologic Atlas group, a number of us will be coming here over time. I think Rick will come in and talk about Minnesota spring inventory. I'll recap that a little bit. And then Vanessa Barato, who's here, will be talking about our program, some of our general products that we produce. So I'll give you an idea of where you can take a look at some of our general products, and then she can go into details when she comes in. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the Karst Hydrogeology of southeast Minnesota. So I'm basically in this 150 years after it started. So I'm going to give a little bit of the background. So I need to look at you when you're on the screen. So okay. So if she's on the screen, I can't advance, so if it looks like I'm pressing this one, we need to do a little dance. So this right here is even kind of controversial. It seems like definitions of Karst are rarely really accepted upon. So right now, this is the current definition that we in the County Geologic Atlas group are using. Basically, it's a lot of people look at it as a landscape terrain, but it's a lot more than just a terrain. You know, you can see on the surface either sinkholes or springs or sinking streams. But from a hydrogeologic perspective, what we're really looking at is the heterogeneity of flow. So non-Darcian flow that's very rapid, up to miles per day. That's really where we approach Karst, at least through our group. So with a little bit of a history, Native people have been in southeastern Minnesota for as long as thousands of years, and undoubtedly they use springs in southeastern Minnesota for sources of fresh water. It wasn't until the Europeans came and started doing mapping, so we're doing the dance again here. Mapping that we really started to get a handle of the geology, and once we know more about the geology, we can start to learn more about the Karst features and Karst flow, the Karst phenomenon. So the first map that I'm aware of for the state of Minnesota was created in 1851, which was actually 7 years before Minnesota was a state. And what you're looking at here is just kind of southeastern Minnesota. So this would be Houston County, Winona County, Gilmore, etc. So there's the first geologic map, and in geologic mapping, you're starting to characterize the landscape, the rocks that water ultimately flows through. So following that came Newton Horace Winchell. He's one of the preeminent scientists of the day. He's kind of the founder of the Department of Earth Sciences at the University of Minnesota. In the 1870s, he came along and started mapping. And in a volume that he created, he actually went into each county in Minnesota and characterized both the landform, the geology of both unconsolidated deposits, consolidated deposits, hydrogeology. He characterized chemistry. He made some really important observations of the day. So here's a map of Olmsted County from his volume 1, which was 1872 to 1882. And by this time, they're really starting to map and understand some of the different ages of rocks and also the characteristics of the rocks. So in terms of Karst, this is where they're really starting to get a good handle on observing sinkholes at the landscape, large springs, and more importantly, the connectivity between sinkholes and those springs. So another very karstic county in southeastern Minnesota, Fillmore County, here's a map of that as well. So within that volume, he also did some very detailed sketches of the hydrostratigraphy and the stratigraphy. So this right here is a general profile of the river valley, but in it the numbers correspond to different geologic units. So we can see with time we're really starting to characterize the work all these people that came before, the modern people who studied karst, really laid a great foundation. So,
hey, Liz,
Yeah.
ask people to mute.
Yeah, I'm trying to find who it is.
No, just announce it. Can everybody mute their phone and/or their computer, whoever's online, please? Thank you.
Thank you. So here's some more of those cross sections, basically that Newton Winchell described within the volume 1, and importantly, with respect to karst and that, in these diagrams, he's very astute in determining where certain lines of springs are, and understandably, they're basically related to the geology. So where there are shale deposits lower than these fractured limestones, that's where we get lines of springs. So this work's kind of laying the framework for modern researchers. So within the same volume, although the word karst is not used, the narrative really describes karst phenomena. So you can see that he refers to sinkholes in this first box up here, basically describing how some of the sinkholes are basically occurrent lines, which happens to do with lineaments in the landscape and fractures where they're preferentially lined up. And then in the last box on the right, he describes basically a dry valley on Canfield Creek where the Canfield Creek basically flows underground for about 12 miles before it reemerges at Odessa Spring.
So, what is a line spring?
Pardon?
What is a line?
Oh, so a line of springs would be on the landscape where if you have a fractured limestone or a dolomite and a shale or some sort of impermeable bed underneath it, water would basically go to that impermeable bed and then flow laterally. So then you would have a line of springs that are flowing laterally across that impermeable bed. So what you're seeing here in both the mapping and in the narrative is that he's describing karst geology, just the word karst isn't used. So following that, in 1911, another seminal work is Hall, Minder, and Fuller, and in that, once again, there's a lot of discussion, or at least observation of karst with respect to sinkholes and springs. In particular, the area of Fountain, which probably a lot of people, if you've ever been on tours of southeastern Minnesota, there's kind of a quintessential karst tour that Calvin Alexander's brought a lot of people on over the year, and Fountain Big Spring is located, this is the village of Fountain. There's a large quarry just to the north, and the Fountain Big Spring is on the north side of that quarry. But in the paragraph that I've highlighted in the red box there, you can see that this is a very good description of karst phenomena, because he talks about basically abandoning the spring in the town because the spring turned muddy after a large storm event. So that's basically a data to suggest that during large overland runoff events, water was running into sinkholes, kind of flushing those conduits out and making the water muddy at the spring. So although that's not an NTU from a turbidity meter, that's certainly a narrative describing that phenomena. So I'm not hitting every single person who's characterized southeastern Minnesota karst phenomena, but I'm trying to hit some of the big names to kind of lay a framework to where we are today. Another big person that worked in the early 1900s is Thaddeus Serber. He was not a geologist, he was actually a biologist that worked for the predecessor to the Minnesota DNR, and he did a biological survey of the entire Root River. So he walked every single mile and tributary stream all through the Root River. But what he did was he made some really great maps that showed locations of karst features, predominantly springs that he encountered on springs and tributaries, but he also noted some other things as well. So here's a close-up of that map that I just showed you for the Spring Valley area. And in this close-up, there's notations for springs in particular. Sinkholes are drawn on the map, and even caves. So Serber was pretty astute in his observations, and luckily he recorded those for us, that we can basically look back at that. we jump a couple decades now, and the first known dye trace that occurred, that we're aware of, that occurred in Minnesota was done by a Department of Health engineer named Kingston, and they were typhoid outbreaks. So typhoid outbreaks were typically waterborne problems, with septic issues, getting into water supplies. So Kingston did two different dye traces that we're aware of. One in Fillmore County, I think in Canton, and then the other just in Olmsted County in the vicinity of Rochester. But he used fluorescein dye and was able to determine that these contaminated wells were contaminated through these dye traces. Following Serber, another preeminent fisheries personnel from the Minnesota DNR was a guy named Mel Hogstead, and he was a real kind of genius in terms of his notations. He totally geeked out. Between 1959 and 2012, he chronicled every single fish he caught, and took very interesting notes, and all that's available through the Lanesboro fishery location. So, yeah, the guy caught almost 33,000 fish and, described their weight and their length and the species. So, really interesting scientist. And he left many, many maps, 1 to 24K quads, where he walked in streams and noted locations of groundwater seepage, groundwater springs, etc. So, some personnel at the PCA Rochester office, Ashley Ignatius, some of you may know her. She's a GIS specialist that works for Catherine Logan. She became aware of these maps and a project with a guy who worked in consulting at the time, Jeff Rodeberg. They started to basically rectify all these spring locations, and a lot of that data ended up working its way into the Minnesota Spring Inventory that Greg Brick came in and talked about not too long ago, and that I'll cover a little bit later in the talk. So jump ahead a couple more decades, and a very interesting citizen scientist named Ron Spong started doing lots of dye traces in southeastern Minnesota, taking very detailed notes, and a lot of that work we have retained to this day, and it's available in maps in a project that we're currently working on, that Wes Rulonis, who's in the back, has been working with Calvin Alexander and Jeff Green to make a lot of these data available. 1970s to today, Calvin and Alexander, if any of you went to the University of Minnesota and studied hydrology or geology, you know him, and you probably know him through other avenues as well. But Calvin has been characterizing groundwater flow and educating students for decades. He's an emeritus professor now. The map on the right is probably one of the most used maps in Minnesota agencies, and that was a product that he made with one of his grad students and Jeff Green. But Calvin's interest really went away from planetary science, where he got his PhD in studying moon rocks, and he really got interested in dye tracing and conduit flow in southeastern Minnesota. So the majority of the work that occurred in southeastern Minnesota, Calvin basically either was involved with it or his lab ran the analysis with it. So a lot of what we're presenting here is either related to Calvin or was completed by Calvin. So I'm not going to read through all the bullet points, but a lot of geochemistry, all those things, all these different disciplines within hydrologic sciences, Calvin has had an interest in, and it helped us characterize groundwater flow in southeastern Minnesota. And then there's been a lot of overlap with his work between agencies, consultants, etc. Jeff Green, he's kind of Calvin's sidekick in a lot of this work. He's been working with Calvin, I think, from the late 80s through today. He's still dye tracing in southeastern Minnesota. He's out of the Rochester office, so a lot of this work he's been directly involved with as well. Jeff has also done some karst features mapping in terms of actually finding karst features on the landscape and recording those. and then he does a fair amount of karst landscape mapping where he takes the geological characterization in terms of units, and then he kind of converts that into a landscape unit that allows water resource managers to look at a geologic unit and think about it from a water resource perspective in terms of how would water flow through this, how would it impact downstream resources or aquifers below it. So starting in the 80s through today, there's been a collaboration with the Minnesota Geological Survey and the Minnesota DNR County Geologic Atlas Group, and that's who I'm with. And what we've been doing is slowly moving throughout the state and characterizing the geology and groundwater flow of counties in Minnesota. So the map here shows which counties the Minnesota Geological Survey has been to for the Part A. And so the MGS does a Part A atlas, and that's typically the geologic characterization. So kind of the container for the water. It's buried sand and gravel aquifers, water table aquifers, bedrock if there's Paleozoic or some other sort of bedrock that water moves through. So they map the location, the spatial distribution, and in recent years they've actually been creating 3D models. So the products actually come out as rasters. Early work just came out as flat maps. So following a Part A being completed, the DNR comes in and does what's called the Part B, and that's the groundwater characterization. And the Part B uses that geological framework to help us understand aquifer distribution, aquifer residence time, general chemistry, pollution sensitivity, how aquifers are connected to activities on the land surface. So this map here is our current map for the counties that we are either working in currently or counties that we have completed a Part B atlas. And there's a lag time between the Part A is released, and depending on what point in time, we're looking at like a 3 to 4 year lag time between a Part A being finished and a Part B coming out. So linking the County Geologic Atlas Group and Geological Survey back to Karst in particular, some of the counties that have Karst in them, we've done specialty maps. So those have consisted either of sinkhole prediction maps, sinkhole mapping, just mapping the actual sinkholes and springs within a county, and those are available. Some of those are just older paper files, so they're not available in a GIS environment. But they can give you a general sense. It's kind of a combination of actual mapping of karst features at the landscape and then coupling that with the underlying geology to predict where sinkholes may occur. So starting in the late 1990s, a lot of the paper files that Calvin and others had collected through counties were kind of in files, and GIS was really starting to become really commonplace. A lot of people are using GIS, and it became clear that the karst features could be put into a database environment similar to the county well index. So at the time, Calvin had a student named Gal, and he and Bob Tipping at the Minnesota Geological Survey helped Calvin develop the karst features database for the state of Minnesota. So I don't know how many people here use GIS, but it's a pretty common layered, and it's quite a remarkable database. So the figures on the left is kind of just an example of what paper notes might have been for this specific set of seats and springs. That's what an old quad would have looked like. And then in creating the database, they basically geo-rectified all these different point locations, assigned attributes to it, and now it's all available through Minnesota Geospatial Commons. I'll touch back on this momentarily. So just still progressing through time, getting closer and closer to today. About 4 years ago, Calvin Alexander and Jeff Green basically compiled and made a compendium of all the dye traces they've conducted in the state of Minnesota. to show the locations of the dye traces, the spring sheds that they were able to basically delineate with those dye traces, and kind of give a small narrative of a conceptual model for karst flow in Minnesota. This was a flat map, just available as a paper product or a PDF. And obviously to create this map, there was a GIS file that existed, but it has been built over a long period of time, and not all the attributes had, you know, some of the attributes were null, some of them were blank. So we were reluctant to make that GIS product available to people, and through that, we started working on a project over the last 2.5, 3 years, working with Calvin and Jeff and Westford Lonis and other people at the Earth Science Department to basically update all these vectors. So the vectors are the line from where the dye was put in the ground to the spring that it showed up at, or the stream that it came out of. So we've been trying to basically say what dye was used, what the mass of the dye was, when we put it in the ground, when it showed up, to get a general travel time. So we're really just trying to get all that data available. Calvin's an emeritus professor now, he's retired. Jeff is closer to retirement age, so we're just trying to capture everything we can while we still can, and make it available in a database that in the future people can access, and not really have a whole lot of questions when they look at it. Most of those attributes will be populated so that people can look at that and either try to replicate that or use that in their water resource management decisions. You know, so for instance, in this area in your fountain, you know, if there's a truck of milk or something else spills, what direction do we think that's going to flow? What springs or trout streams should we look at to see if there's if it's milk, like a biological oxygen demand or something like that. So just trying to make all this available. Ultimately, we are going to try to make that same digital database material available through our web page, through ArcGIS Online tool, so that a firefighter or a civil response person, or escaping me right now, the duty officer, someone like that could actually go to the web page, move into the area where something occurred, and they could actually zoom in and get a general sense of where they should look, or potentially look. So that's getting close to today. So yeah, so that's kind of a timeline. So a lot of people have done a lot of work over a period of time, and collectively, I think the understanding Minnesota karst is greatly improved from all these different people with their different disciplines all working together to really characterize the same phenomenon. So here's that same map from Calvin and Gow and Green, and maybe it's just a discipline that I'm in, but it seems like I've seen that map hundreds of times. So, and maybe some of you have too, so I just thought I'd include it a couple times. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and just talk about karst itself. So in southeastern Minnesota, there's a lot of fractured rock, and some of the rock was dissolved through dissolution, which is kind of more of a typical karst. Some of it's mechanically fractured. But from a water resources perspective, what really is the key take-home point is that water moves really, really quickly through it. So if water fell on the land surface on the picture on the left, it could clearly move down even through potential shaly layers that are within this unit to deeper aquifers very quickly, just due to all this fracturing and dissolution. The example on the right is a cave system in southeastern Minnesota in Fillmore County. So obviously water can move really quickly through these environments. It's equivalent to curb and gutter, right, in this urban stormwater setting. Superficial expressions of karst. Lots of sinkholes in Fillmore and Olmsted County, other counties as well, Winona, Houston. But I would say Olmsted and Fillmore clearly have many more than the others, and then lots of large springs. That spring there in the center photo is in Houston County, and then also lots of sinking streams. So sinking streams occur through a lot of different geologic units. In the last 10 years, Jeff Green made some pretty astute observations that sinking streams also occur in units that are lower than your traditional karst. So in Minnesota, traditional karst is typically either a limestone or a dolostone, something that dissolves, it has dissolution. Jeff has found sinking streams in siliciclastic units, so the St. Lawrence, which is typically a aquitard on a regional scale, and the underlying Tunnel City group, which some of you might know as the Franconia. Each of those units has sinking streams and springs in it, so there's still not a good handle on whether those are from dissolution or mechanical fractures, but either way, we're still talking about very rapid velocities of 300 plus meters per day.
What's the picture on the left?
The picture on the left is of St. Cole in Fillmore County. And then another manifestation of karst in southeastern Minnesota are the trout streams. There are lots of cold water trout streams in Minnesota that are typically spring fed. So understanding karst in southeast Minnesota has more than just hydrogeologic or water resource perspective. There's also there's aesthetics, but there's also recreational and economic interest to understand karst. And so dye tracing. So dye tracing is the primary tool that's been used over the last 3-4 decades to understand karst flow in southeastern Minnesota. And really what it allows us to do is determine connections between where a dye is put in the ground and where the dye is found. And in doing that, we know what direction the water, the direction the water flew. And then as well as if we know a good handle on the time we put it in and the time it was recovered, we can get a general sense of groundwater velocity. So those are really key points in understanding the hydrogeology down there, residence time, et cetera. And then if you have enough of those point-to-point connections in a similar locale, you're able to actually delineate a groundwater shed to a certain spring. So, if you have, 2 or more basically vectors drawn from an input point to a resurgence point, it'll give you enough confidence that you can loosely draw a groundwater shed. And then that would help you as well with water resource management in terms of nitrate loading perhaps at a spring or spill response to a spring. So ultimately that's been the goal, and that's where a lot of the money came from to do this work, was through the LCCMR to do spring shed mapping. So dye tracing, you need just a couple things, either a sinkhole or a stream sink, losing stream, you need dye. The dye on the right there is a fluorescein dye. It's also known as uranine, but if you've ever gone in to have your eyes checked at the optometrist, and they've dropped a dye on your eye to see if you have a scratched lens, it's the same dye that we use. It's I don't know any LD50s or any of that, something that some of you might be interested in, but they are natural organic dyes. The EPA views them that they're safe, but I don't have any more than that for you. And then there are 2 primary ways, and unless you use a lot of dye, where you just kind of overload the system and you see a spring turn green or red or whatever color you're using, other than that, the dyes are going to show up in the water but not be visible. So we need to collect a water sample or kind of a proxy for that water and bring it back to a lab, put it in some instrumentation, a spectrophotometer, and it basically will tell you intensity peak at a certain wavelength, and that wavelength represents the dyes that you use. So there are 2 straightforward ways to do it. The most simple is using a passive charcoal detector. Carbon has a strong affinity to grab organic molecules. The dyes are organic, so the dyes will basically adsorb to the carbon, and then you can kick them off of it and use it in spectrophotometer to figure out whether the dye is there or not. In other instances, in particular for traces that you've already completed and you know the dye is going to show up, we can set up auto samplers, and that really gives us a much better handle on the travel time and velocity of the water flowing to the spring. So here is a slide that basically represents that. So at left, just your standard ISCO water sampler set up at a spring in Houston County. But on the right are two different graphs. The one on the top is a Galena Stillville karst system, and that's your classic karst. You know, big cave systems, sinkholes, fractured flow, really rapid velocities. And if you look at it, you can see the breakthrough curve, and that's just when the dye arrived, when it met its maximum, and then the recessional limb. And in the Galena, for this particular trace, dye arrived in roughly 10 hours or so after injection. The lower breakthrough curve is for the St. Lawrence Lone Rock pseudokarst system, and that's the system that I mentioned Jeff Green has been working on for the last 10 years. So this is typically a system that no one really thought there was fractured flow in. Most people thought the St. Lawrence was a regional aquitard. It turns out in Sykes Valley systems in southeastern Minnesota, there's actually fractures in the system and rapid flow through the system. So this breakthrough curve basically shows that the initial arrival of dye in this system, which at a distance twice as far as the Galena, took 14 days versus roughly 10 hours. So very different systems, and the breakthrough curves help us understand those systems and the response of water moving through them. That was just, we're still working on it this morning and forgot to delete that slide. Yes?
Can you use those curves to estimate how much total dye came through?
Yep.
Okay, you did that?
Yeah, not in every case, but yeah, you need to have standards, and then you can basically determine, the mass would be the area under the curve, so then you can really determine the mass of the dye recovered versus the mass of the dye that was introduced. And that's another reason why it's really important to track within the database that we've been working on masses of dyes, where we use them. Because I think in the future, when people do more dye tracing, having those data available will help them determine the appropriate amount of dye for the different hydrostratigraphic system they're working in. I mentioned Bob Tipping at the Geological Survey, but in addition to Bob, Tony Runkle, and a couple other people in their Paleozoic staff, Julia Steenberg and Andrew Retzler, have really been doing a lot on conduit flow in southeastern Minnesota. And a really phenomenal piece of work that they put out, it's almost 5 years ago now, although these dates are different. But it's 1402 is 2014, so roughly 4 years ago. But this is a project that Catherine Logan and Justin Watkins out of PCA's Rochester office kind of dreamt up, and they hired the Geological Survey to do this work. And ultimately, it's really kind of a watershed scale piece of work where they looked at nitrate data for wells, springs, and surface water bodies through southeastern Minnesota to really try to get a handle on whether or not there are geological controls on nitrate distribution. So are certain aquifers or streams more influenced by the geology and the hydrogeology? So is that part of, more than just a land use equation? I think everyone's seen the percentage of crops, versus nitrate, and that chart. This was taking one more step to see if there's a control related to the geology. And I'm sure there are a lot of different disciplines in here, but anyone who does watershed science or hydrogeology, even surface water science, this is a really great resource that I highly recommend. So here is just an example of one of the hydrogeologic cross sections where, kind of in a cartoon schematic, they've really shown for the Galena. This is an area, I think, down near Fountain, Minnesota. But they're showing how the fractured bedrock system is more connection with the land surface, and they used nitrates as a proxy, but in other figures and part of the narrative, they also use tritium, which is an isotope that you can get relative residence time through as well. So I'm not going to go into details about that, but the Geological Survey does a lot of work on conduit flow in Minnesota, and not only karst conduit flow, but conduit flow in other aquifers as well, siliciclastic aquifers. So this is just an example. They're able to do science being related to the University of Minnesota that we couldn't do in our group. They're able to outfit wells and do borehole geophysics, install packers and flow meters, and really get a handle on the water moving through aquifers, the aquifer characteristics, and then, you know, couple that with chemistry to really get a better understanding of flow through these aquifers. So, as I mentioned, they're not working in karst aquifers alone. Here's a really great report that they just put out that could probably fit well with some of you that do remediation in the Twin Cities metro or anything with deeper Paleozoic aquifers. And this is a report in particular on the St. Lawrence, which is, as I mentioned earlier, thought to be a regional aquitard, but depending on where you are within the Twin Cities basin, it does have conduit flow characteristics as well. So couple all that work, you know, through that history timeline, through Earth Sciences Department, through the DNR, through the Geological Survey, and there's some agreed upon karst systems in Minnesota that are related to specific geologic units. So Runkle and others at the MGS have identified 3 of them: the Cedar Valley, the Galena-Stillville, and the Prairie du Chien. The Prairie du Chien probably is applicable to a lot of you in this room as well. And one of the big findings that they found in the Prairie du Chien is that the geologic contact between the upper Shakopee and the lower Oneota is a really high transmissivity zone. And that is manifested itself in failures of sewage lagoons through southeastern Minnesota and a number of different things that I'm sure would be of interest to certain people at PCA. But as I mentioned, in the last 10 years, we've been doing a lot of work in the siliciclastic units in these incised river valleys. So the St. Lawrence and Lone Rock, although it doesn't show dissolution through these rapid conduits, the rapid flow through these conduit systems, so because it doesn't show dissolution, we're referring to it as a pseudo-karst aquifer. It has karst-like properties, but it doesn't show the dissolution that's required to be a traditional karst. Here's just kind of a similar conceptual model that the Geological Survey has put out for some of these different hydrostratigraphic units, and it's broken down into either aquifer or aquitard, and then on the right, those black horizontal lines show where they're preferential conduits. So whether it's conduits in limestones or dolostones, or whether they're conduits in siliciclastic units, there's a lot of conduit flow in the Paleozoic section. So I'm not going to read these to you. This is more of just kind of a visual trip through Paleozoic rock units, and nor am I going to go to every single rock unit down through the section. But the Devonian carbonates, kind of that upper karst with lots of sinkholes. The descriptions here are from another Geological Survey product called our Report of Investigation 61. So if any of you ever need any specific details, you can get much more specific aquifer properties through that report. My understanding is they're probably going to update that sometime soon too. So there's the Devonian, lots of fractures, vertical fractures, horizontal fractures, etc. The Galena group, pretty similar too, mostly carbonates, dissolution, cave systems, rapid flow, sinkholes, springs, very fractured. The Galena group, this is the largest spring in Minnesota. It's barely in Minnesota. It's right on the Iowa border. This is Odessa Spring, and it's a monster. It's like 20 CFS, I think, under base flow conditions. It is a big spring, and it can jump several orders of magnitude after a large precip event or snow melt event. And then, so this is just a picture of the quarry, and down near Harmony, a little northwest of Harmony, Tony Runkle in the picture for scale, but you can see both the vertical fractures that allow water to basically move over some of these interbedded aquitards within the unit, as well as the large bedding plane fractures that water can move through. So Fountain Big Spring, I mentioned that when I talked about the 1911 Hall report, and he had pretty astute observations that although it runs clear and it was a water source, that after a big event it could turn muddy. Well, there's Fountain Big Spring after a large rain event. The turbidity just spikes. Nitrate levels go down. Dilution, dissolution, but the NTUs go way up. So here's data I think that Justin Watkins collected at Fountain, just showing that same thing. So that lowermost defined Karst system from Runkle et al. Is the Prairie du Chien. So the Shakopee typically is a little more karstic than the Oneota. The Oneota is a little more massive bed, but as I mentioned, the contact between the two of them has a lot of rapid flow, and that's really where some of the larger sewage lagoon failures in southeastern Minnesota have occurred, when they built the lagoon close to the top of that contact. Oneota, part of that same system, but the Oneota can act as on a regional scale as an aquitard. The Jordan really isn't a karst. There aren't many even large springs in the Jordan. There's a really big one on Highway 76 in Houston County, but the Jordan, I think, is more of a intergranular flow as far as people have characterized it. So then here's the St. Lawrence. So the St. Lawrence, on a regional scale, even in MDA's well code, is an aquitard. However, in these deeply incised valleys, it is leaky. Water's moving through the top of it into the tunnel city below at hundreds of meters per day.
What does incised mean?
Just a deep valley, so where water is basically cut down and created large valleys. And then the underlying tunnel city group, a siliciplastic, meaning a sandstone and siltstone shales, and an aquifer, but in the tunnel city as well, a lot of the flow is basically on those conduits, so the bedding plane fractures. But clearly there's a staircasing effect through the tunnel city as well that we've determined through dye traces over the last 10 years. So in the last, it's taken a couple of years to get it up and running, but for almost a year now, we installed equipment in February 2017. We've been outfitting springs in southeastern Minnesota. So we currently have 2 springs in Olmsted County in the Galena. We have a Prairie du Chien spring in Fillmore County, east of Chatfield. Then we have another spring in Harmony, that's in the Galena. And then we have a spring in the probably Upper Tunnel City, Lower St. Lawrence in Winona County. But what we've been doing is monitoring flow and major anions at these springs to see how the response basically between precipitation events and snowmelt events. How quickly is there a response in the aquifer? What does it do to the chemistry? And what does it look like in relation to each other? So we're only really starting to get enough data to start working it up. I will show you a graph at one of the springs. So here are a couple of the sites. The one on the left is a Galena spring in West Olmsted. The one on the right is a Prairie du Chien spring east of Chatfield. But here is kind of our poster child site right now. This is Bear Spring in Olmsted County. It flows into Bear Creek. And the spring house is technically the barn on the left. The flow that you're seeing coming from the upper right is actually an overflow cave. So under certain flow conditions, the spring basically backs up and overflows out of the upper cave system. But this is Bear Spring with our equipment in place. And here's the data we have to date. On the top, you're looking at precipitation and snow depths from the Rochester Airport site, from the NOAA site. And on the bottom, the green hydrograph is a Galena well at the Marion Rest Stop, which is about 1.5 miles south of this spring. And then the blue hydrograph is discharge, so cubic feet per second discharge from Bear Spring. They're clearly tracking well to each other and are proxy to each other. Plotted against that, the red are just grab samples of nitrate. So definitely high nitrate at this spring. 20 parts per million and higher. This is a good plug now for a collaboration that we've been doing. This Sentinel Springs project is not happening just in a silo at the DNR. There's a lot of overlap, and maybe I flew past it up here. Yeah. So PCA is one of the big players in this, and Catherine Logan and Justin Watkins in particular have been really instrumental in helping us get the project going. And what they've done in particular is found and dedicated nitrotax units, so continuous nitrate, for at least 3 of these sites. So right now we have them installed at 2 of the sites. The third site will be Bear Spring, the one that I just showed you. And ultimately, the goal is just to understand nitrate levels, nitrate dilution increases, trends, and then ultimately, if we collect data for a long enough time from the PCA's perspective, I believe we should be able to see whether BMPs, field scale BMPs are working. And Department of Ag really has that same vested interest. They've been helping us recently set up the site in Harmony. They've thrown some money at it in terms of field time for helping develop the rating curves. Olmsted County is running all the anions for us because they are very interested in it, and they have a Part B atlas that we'll be working on shortly. And then the Geological Survey is a partner in the sense that they're going to help us understand the hydrostratigraphy, the location of these springs, which units they're coming out of.
What are you using to measure flow?
So right now we have basically a stage. We're developing stage discharge. So it's a pressure transducer, and then we're sending staff over time with the area velocity probe, and we're developing your standard stage discharge relationships, and then we apply that regression towards the stage to convert it to discharge.
Why do you only measure anions?
Because it's very expensive, and we don't have a dedicated budget at this point. Ultimately, we hope to go to the LCCMR and get hard funding for this. So at this point, Terry Lee, who was the manager down there for about 30 years, who just retired last week, basically is willing to run anions for us. But and to be more specific, nitrate is really what I think the PCA and the MDA are primarily concerned with. Chloride is another good indicator of anthropogenic activity. So, in an effort to keep the cost down, yet collect data, anions seem to make the most sense.
Department of Ag does some pesticide monitoring in the springs as well.
They do. We have that data. They're not at these springs, but that is part of our project. I appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, and hopefully maybe at the end of this, if people are aware of data that we should be aware of, or vice versa, if you'd like to ask us about data that we may be able to get to you, it'd be great to have that conversation. Quickly kind of wrap things up here. So there's the Bear site. I bounced back to talk about the collaborators and the reason why. Here's a nitrotax unit in the yellow and orange running at Crystal Springs. That's in Winona County up near Altura or Elba, that kind of general vicinity. Crystal Springs is lower St. Lawrence Upper Tunnel City Group spring. We do have flow at a spring that's located about a mile to the north. The way Crystal Springs is engineered in terms of their raceways for raising fish is very difficult to determine flux there. So we're using a proxy spring that's located about a mile away. But coupling the nitrotax unit, so there's not a whole lot of variability in nitrogen at this lower stratigraphic position. But if you couple that with MDA, some of the sampling that you just mentioned, pesticide, nitrate, you can see over time that nitrate levels, at least within the lower Tunnel City and Lone Rock in this vicinity, there's a trend moving upward. Lastly, Karst Features Database. I touched on it earlier with Gow and Alexander and Green, tipping all those characters. That is a standalone product now. It's available through the Minnesota Geospatial Commons. What you don't see in the Karst Features Database now are springs. And that's because about 2 years ago, the County Geologic Atlas Group, in an effort to help this very incredible product not kind of go stagnant, we started a project called the Minnesota Spring Inventory, where we basically extracted all the springs from the Karst feature database, moved it into a statewide layer, and since then have been moving out state, because the primary springs that have been located in Minnesota were all in the southeast. I've mentioned it a couple times, the Minnesota Dye Trace database. We are getting very close to having at least a version 1 on this product. It's a collaborative effort, just having Calvin look through his files, Jeff look through his files, Wes doing database management, but ultimately this product will be available very soon. We do have a request page, a request email on our web page where you can request it. Right now, we're a little bit reluctant to get it out just because we don't want to have a bunch of versions because we're that close to finishing it, at least at this level. But in the dye trace database, we've gone back to every single dye trace, reevaluated the vectors, reevaluated, repositioned the input locations to springs based on LiDAR or field locations, and then reposition the springs to field located spring locations. And all that's available and updated with attributes. So we're really close to having it available to you, and your point of contact will very likely be Wes Green, who's in the Wes Relentless, who's in the back of the room here. Another thing we've done as part of that is there's a caver in southeastern Minnesota named John Ackerman who owns a lot of caves, and for areas where we have dye traces that have gone through cave systems, we have rectified the cave surveys so that we could have the dye flows, the vectors move through the cave systems. So, in these cases, we know water has moved, the dye has moved through these systems, so we can do it to this level of detail. And others similar to that one, the dye, I can assure you, did not travel that path, but that's the best stylistic path we could draw for that trace. So here we are at the County Geologic Program that I'm in. This is our main web page. If you want to look at some of the Karst-specific information, go to the Maps and Studies link. That will get you to this web page. So the County Geologic Atlases, those might apply to other people here that don't work in the Karst area. Those are all available through that top link, the first link on the page. And that would get you to all of our Part Bs, and I think it would even get you a link to the Part As as well. But Karst-specific information is available down a few levels at the Spring Shed, and Karst link. And that would get you to this page. And within this link is the Minnesota Spring Inventory that I just mentioned, that Greg had come through and talked about in the past. If you click on the Springs Inventory link within that page, the blue link right there, that would get you to the Minnesota Spring Inventory page on the left. And there's a reporting application where if you're out doing field work and you come across a spring, you can actually report, and that one of our staff to review that location. So please, if you're doing field work and find springs, please add them. We'll take all we can get. And then that's a current map of the springs that have been mapped in the state of Minnesota. So you can see that we've moved out of the primary emphasis of southeastern Minnesota back within the Karst Features database, and since then, between field work and springs submitted by other agencies and citizens, we've definitely increased the distribution of those springs throughout the state. So on the same Karst and Spring Shed page, just lower than the MSI link, is a dye tracing section. If you click on the dye tracing link, that will get you to our dye tracing page. And what we've done is gone through great lengths to find old reports or even generate reports that had not been created just through too much work going on at the time, things falling through the cracks. So what we're still working on this. We're still trying to update as many reports as we can, but they're listed by county. Below the counties, there's a whole bunch of different Karst-related reports from conference proceedings, journal articles, things like that. And then in some of those reports, they get you basically, in addition to the narrative, the method used, the location, et cetera, some of the reports have kind of a higher resolution schematics of and understanding the flow in those neighborhoods. And then lastly, So the map that I showed that Calvin created with Gal and Green that a lot of folks have seen and I've plugged a couple times before, that was just a static map. The shape files for that had been lost. And since its generation, the Minnesota Geological Survey has gone back to a lot of those counties and remapped the counties. So that means that the characterization, the shape of the polygons has changed since that original map was made. So a couple of years ago, we visited that map and basically worked with Calvin and folks at the MGS to basically create a version of that map. And that map, the polygons and the approach used are all available through our website as well at the bottom of that Spring and Karst page. So if you clicked on that, and then, yeah, the Karst features and inventory points. So this is pretty much all the Karst features sans the springs, because the springs are now by themselves a standalone project through the MSI. And then, yeah, so here's the new map for the map that I've been talking about through the entire. And it extends up into Pine County based on some work that one of Calvin's grad students, Steph Shade, did. There's a sandstone karst up near Askov. And then there is a report that talks about the approach we used, which geologic units we included, the rationale that we used. So that's it. Any questions?
We maybe have time for a question. It's about 10 o'clock. We have one online, actually. Our listeners wonder if karst formation is responsible for sinkholes in the Twin Cities, too.
Yes, there have been karst cover collapse sinkholes. There was a really large one, I think, back in the late 70s in the Vadnais Heights area. Photos out there. But then there's smaller sinkholes through the Platteville, and then there have been some collapses into the St. Peter. That's probably more of either way, they're conflict-related cover collapses. So there are sinkholes. Obviously, the one on I-94 a few weeks ago, that was a water main break, so you can't assume that every sinkhole is caused by dissolution. Lots of sinkholes, especially in the urban setting, are caused by infrastructure failure.
There's that famous one in Woodbury.
The dancing water.
Dancing water.
Yeah.
That was a sinkhole, wasn't it?
Well, it was a St. Peter over-excavation, so they over-excavated for a stormwater pond. The pond had too much head on it and basically blew out the bottom and there some systematic fractures that were in the St. Peter sandstone.
One interesting talk. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So,
Plan to wrap.
Help Mark on the breccia pipe. He said it was a breccia pipe in the St. Peter.
Love that photo.
Yeah. Well, everything from a
I know, but
general
it's like
public,
it's
everything
so.
from a meteorite crater to a pothole out in the parking lot.